Well, hello. I want to welcome all our attendees at today's town hall on this beautiful, and I must say, unseasonably warm November day. We have an important conversation that we're having today, and it's about our report, Shift Neutral, which is the University of Waterloo's roadmap to carbon neutrality. We're so glad that you're joining us for this important conversation. My name is Jean Andre. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Environment. I also have the pleasure of being co-chair of the President's Advisory Committee on Environmental Sustainability since its formation in 2015. I'm going to be emceeing today's event, and I'll be moderating the discussion and the question and answers. So for our agenda, we'll begin with some opening remarks from our president, and then we will have the Director of Sustainability provide an overview of our climate action plan. And after that, of course, we'll go into the question and answer period where we'll spend quite a bit of our time. I must tell you that the question and answer forum will open up for you to pose questions, but only after we've completed these introductory presentations. Let me just say that I know many of us have been focused on COVID and on the American election and on the economy, but how important it is that we continue to focus on this global challenge of climate change and what it is that we can all do about it. So I'm so delighted that you would join us. So with no further ado, I would like to invite our President and Vice Chancellor, Ferdan Hamdalapur, to provide some opening comments for today's event.
Thank you very much, Jean, and good afternoon, everybody. And again, let me reiterate Jean's warm welcome to everybody, and thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. Before we go any further, it's also my duty and privilege to pay our respects to the past and present elders of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And I also respectfully acknowledge that the University of Waterloo and most of our community, we sit on their traditional territory, the Haldeman Tract, the land that extends on each side of the Grand River. Jean, you're quite right. The past 8 months have kept us very worried and very busy as we and we still are going through this pandemic. It started out as something that we had hoped that will go away soon, and it kept getting worse and worse, and took all our energy and attention to survive through it, to live through it, and to move beyond it, and we're still doing this. However, at no point in time it made us to forget about some of our big global challenges. And of course, our climate change is one such, and it sits right on top of our list of really important big global challenges. And this is what it's about. This is how, as an institution, we wanted to move forward and let everybody know that we have not, even though we have been spending enormous amount of time and energy on fighting COVID-19. It is not at the expense of our focus and attention on the climate change. In 2017, we decided that it was time for us to just do more than just talking about climate change. We have been very proudly letting the whole world know the depth of our commitment and depth of our knowledge and contributions and involvement in sustainability and environmental sustainability. We've always said that we are very proud that we are one of the few institutions that has a standalone faculty of environment. And it was time for us to say, okay, we need to have a plan. We need to have something that not only will enable us to deepen our conversation, but also provide some action. And it was, in my mind, an overdue action that had to be taken. So we started our comprehensive environmental sustainability strategy in putting together some pillars that we already had. So our teaching and learning and practice of environmental sustainability. It was comprehensive, but at the same time, we are blessed to have so many fantastic scholars and researchers. They are looking at various aspects of, again, climate change, environmental sustainability, and what needs to be done. And thirdly, our engagement, our work with our community, immediate campus community and communities beyond our campus, that we had this engagement. But we needed something to tell the whole world that we're not only just talking about these, we're not just researching, teaching, learning, and that required that we needed to have a plan in place to reduce, to minimize, hopefully bring it to zero, our carbon footprint on our campus, because we know how it's affecting our climate. It has affected, and it's continuing to do so. So, as Jean mentioned, I was very happy to see that President's Advisory Committee on Environmental Sustainability took off with a lot of energy and vision, and that's what we're doing today. Today we're gathered here to tell you, to share our report with you, to show that these are the things that we have put in place, but this is not where we're stopping. Sorry. We have started some time ago, and there is no stopping for us. There are things that I'm very proud that we have in place, but by no means that they will justify saying that we have done all we could. In our report, we make a very important commitment. We say by 2050, we will reach carbon neutrality. It is not easy in an environment like ours. It's not easy for a very energy intensive campus from various aspects, but we made that commitment, and we will live by this commitment, making sure that by 2050 we will reach carbon neutrality. And how are we going to do this? We have many things that we have in place. We are going from how we are minimizing our waste to energy usage, to water usage, all kinds of things that we're going to be able to do and showcase. At the same time, I'm well aware of many conversations ranging from how the university makes its investments to where do we get our energy? What are the sources of energy? All of these are important questions, and I'm delighted that by presenting this report, we are providing a forum with all of you to be able to continue contributing on this enormously important subject. I am grateful to the committee, Jean, Dennis, Matt, and all the other members of the committee, and you put your heart and soul and energy and your vision, your wisdom into creation of this report. And though we shared parts of this, the whole report with our community earlier on, this is the time that we re-engage, restart the conversation. This is where I think we will hear from you. I look forward to hearing from you. And let me again thank you sincerely for being with us, as Jean again mentioned, on this beautiful afternoon. I'm just so delighted that we have a lot of sunshine. I had to go and close the blinds. Can you believe that I needed to close the blinds? But I needed a better camera view. With that, I'll stop. We have an important conversation. We have an important presentation. Again, Jean, I'll turn it back over to you, and look forward to hearing from you and listening to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, President Hamdallah, for your comments, but more importantly, I think for your commitment, as you stated it, and for your leadership on environmental sustainability on the campus and on embarking on this journey with all of us to carbon neutrality. Next up, I'm going to ask the Director of Sustainability, Matt Tyson, who's worked very hard on this plan alongside many others, and he's going to give an overview of our Shift Neutral Climate Action Plan.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jean, and delighted to be here today and part of this conversation and echoing many of the points that the President shared and Jean mentioned on the importance of taking action on this topic for the university. I want to start with kind of a high-level overview. If you've seen the plan, it is posted online, uwaterloo.ca/sustainability/climate plan. And if you've read it, you know it's a fairly in-depth document. So we won't be able to cover everything today, but I wanted to provide an overview and touch on many of those key points, and then really leave the floor open for that question and answer to dive into a few more details. So some of the genesis of the climate action plan, as the President mentioned, was driven by the launch of our environmental sustainability strategy in 2017. This was a comprehensive plan, but we knew at the time there was no way we could dive into all of the detail that needed to be there in terms of how we would tackle climate change. There was a similar commitment that was made through all universities in Ontario to develop a roadmap to low carbon campuses through the Council of Ontario Universities. And so those two things, as well as some of the language in the new strategic plan that we heard through lots of different stakeholder feedback in the development of that plan, this is a really key deliverable of that to move things forward. And so just to show kind of how these different pieces tie together. And of course, climate change connects with so many different local and global issues, social and economic, that we're dealing with in real time right now. I'll just note that we have this year now released our 2020 Environmental Sustainability Report. So if you want more information on kind of the latest of where we are and the actions that are being taken across so many different teams on campus, you can take a look online, uwaterloo.ca/sustainability/report. Again, to mention some really big thanks that went into the development of this plan. This was certainly a team effort from many different areas, led by the Climate and Energy Working Group of the President's Advisory Committee. Some of the key stakeholders, obviously plant operations is a really critical partner in this conversation. Campus housing, really, a huge portion of our building footprint comes from our housing team, and so they were really important and valuable to have at the table. Space planning. And we were really pleased to have a couple of our research institutes that really touch on climate and energy, the Waterloo Institute for Sustainable Energy and the Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change, as well as a wider group of core stakeholders and advisors that had subject matter expertise on either planning or energy or policy. And so that included everyone from our institutional analysis and planning team to faculty with really specific research expertise in certain areas, and many of our students as well, who joined in some of that planning effort. This didn't happen overnight. I think we took a very intentional process to develop this climate action plan over the past 2 years. So beginning in 2018, we were looking across North America and even beyond. What are some of the best examples we could research on leading practice? What are other campuses doing? Where's the state of the technology or industry, and how is that maturing? We found a few that were leading practice and led some interviews with them on how they approached the challenge on their own institutions, and then a modeling exercise. What does this look like? What are the the data points and the trends and the points that we can see specific to the University of Waterloo? And then throughout 2019, we took that into a number of different outreach activities. Many of you might have joined some of the open houses. We had 6 different open houses that we launched in early 2019 to gather your input and ideas, and an iterative drafting process throughout the rest of the year to consolidate feedback and integrate many different perspectives. And by the end of the year, we had a document that was brought forward for approval to senior administration and approved in early 2020. And so that's kind of the journey to get us where we are right now. And even though that was done earlier in 2020, we've certainly continued with the implementation despite the challenges of the pandemic. I think it's important to note, as the President mentioned briefly, that there's many different domains at the university that climate change connects to in our teaching and our research, in the collaborations and the partnerships we build with our community. All of these have an influence on climate change and are part of it. What Shift Neutral does is really hone in on how we're tackling our own emissions and our own carbon footprint. And so all of these are extremely important, and there's many activities underway. But the strategy that we're talking about right now, the action plan, really hones in on how we reduce our own emissions. And so that shouldn't take out of context the academic contributions that we're making, which are many and quite impactful, but really demonstrating leadership on our own practice as well. One of those first pieces on the modeling, I won't dive into this in too much detail, but these graphs illustrating, what's our starting point, what's our baseline, and then what do things look like if we make no changes, or forecast what that could look like into the future. And so the pie graph on the left there is a breakdown of where our current emissions are. As of 2018, our 2019 numbers are now published. They look very close to this. There's not a significant amount of change year over year. But you can see from this that natural gas is by far our largest source of emissions on the campus. A couple other things that are interesting to us as well were those purple and the blue slices on commuting to and from the campus and air travel that we do for university purposes. These are very high-level estimates. I will note that there's a lot of assumptions and other calculations that go into that, and we're using them as an estimate. But we wanted to highlight how impactful those pieces are and would need to be looked at in the long term. And on the right-hand side, if we look at the bar graph, what we really see is that taking no action on this, our emissions would continue to grow over time, generally tracking with the growth of the campus. And so we know doing nothing would lead to an increase in emissions, all other things being equal. And that really leads us into this shift now, and we use that language intentionally to think about, how do we shift that direction? Where do we want to go? And so the sustainability strategy looks at this long-term commitment on working towards carbon neutrality by 2050. And as part of the action planning process, we knew 2050 is a long way away. How do we set some more short-term milestones that we can be working towards along that journey? And so the first kind of point along the road is for 2025 to achieve a 17.5% reduction from our 2015 baseline emissions. And we selected 2015 because it's a fairly representative year on a number of different areas, and a good starting point in terms of understanding a representative starting point. You can see here that there's a bit of a tiered mechanism, and so we don't have all of the answers up front, and part of this will be building out those answers over time. And so revisiting this on a 5-year interval to continually set those milestones and continue working towards that long-term target. Of course, there's tons of action that will need to be taken on how to get there. The Climate Action Plan identifies over 46 different actions embedded throughout the document. And so I won't go through them in a huge amount of detail today, but just kind of illustrating some of the different pathways or kind of key pillars that these fall under. One being for energy-related emissions, of course, reducing the amount of energy that we use and using it more efficiently. For the energy that does need to be used on campus, making sure that comes from low carbon or no carbon sources of energy over time. We have a lot of different emissions that are sort of indirect and non-energy, and so having policies and plans in place to mitigate those. And then one pillar that we would have to think out over time is for those sources of emissions which are prohibitively expensive or in some cases technically infeasible to reduce, how do we offset or use carbon offsets as a mechanism to bridge that final gap? As we went through these discussions, there was a lot of interesting points that were raised on the opportunities and barriers within the institution, and really I think we tried to identify some of those strategic points on how we can actually turn the needle and ensure that some of these are moving forward and reflecting that, can we make climate change an institutional key performance indicator, that we're talking about it and it's being presented at various forums so people are aware of it. Sub-metering our buildings, aligning financial incentives, and of course, empowering our people, making sure that there's the staff capacity in place to deliver on these commitments. Energy efficiency has a lot of different components to it. I certainly won't go into too much detail. One, I think, important thing that stands out as we look, again, being on the growth of the campus, a significant push to increasing emissions? How do we make sure that the new construction that we will be doing and new buildings that go up on campus are coming as close as possible to that low carbon or no carbon standard? And so developing that kind of guideline and criteria for our new buildings will be a really critical component to help flattening that curve. And then looking across our existing infrastructure, lots of opportunities within buildings, as well as between buildings as we have a district energy system. I think one piece that's exciting too is that all of us are users of these spaces on campus, or at least in normal times we would be. And so how do we, educate both employees and students on, ways that we can use our spaces efficiently through the Green Office program, Green Residence program, and soon to be our Green Labs program, knowing the carbon and energy footprint that these have. And one of our first steps was on looking at the feasibility studies to help identify opportunity areas in our existing buildings. And once we try to right-size that energy footprint and really make ourselves as efficient as possible, of course, there will be a role for low carbon energy. And there's so much technology development and maturity happening across this space. The economics and the technology is changing almost every year. And so really trying to ensure we're looking at things like geothermal or heat pump technology over time, solar and other renewable energies that will all be a part of a mix of energy solutions for the campus. And of course, a large amount of indirect emissions that we have for commuting, flights and travel. One piece that I think I want to call attention to is on our waste footprint. It's a pretty small percentage of our overall emissions, but it's something that we touch and we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And in our consultations, it was an area that a lot of students and employees really felt passionate and strongly about. And so we have a parallel program on Shift Zero, which is really how do we move the campus towards a zero waste university. And so again, huge kudos to housing and custodial services and food services and so many other teams that are bringing these things to fruition. And of course, last but not least, looking at offsets in the long term and making sure if we are going to need to be purchasing those, which are credible, which are appropriate ways to do so. And when we piece all of that together, this is the kind of roadmap that we look at. It's very much a journey. We could also spend a huge amount of time trying to collect data and do the detailed engineering studies, and we're trying to scaffold some of that as we move through each of these steps and making sure that we're making informed decisions, but going with what we know is going to be necessary, and then adding detail to this outline as we go further down this journey. And so that's going to be a very long process. As the president said, it's not easy, and we certainly have lots of hurdles that we will have to face and overcome. But I'm excited to show that we do have a plan of action moving forward, and that it will really take a kind of community effort to bring us there. And then the last couple minutes, I just wanted to highlight again some very early activities that we've been working through this year. Already, despite being in a very difficult situation because of COVID. One of the first feasibility studies that we've looked at was a campus-wide energy audit of our existing buildings. We know that there's lots of opportunity to improve energy efficiency in our buildings, and so we worked with Walter Fady, a local engineering firm, to conduct a campus-wide energy audit and start helping us quantify and qualify many of those opportunities to bring forward. We've relaunched our climate and energy working group with an eye towards implementation, and are again going through some of the early conversations on development of a standard for those net neutral buildings going forward. Another piece that I'm excited about is our Green Labs framework, and again, how we can engage users in a lab environment, given we are a fairly energy intensive campus because of the research nature of what we do. And next steps going forward, of course, we'll be looking at implementation of all of these different actions that are in the plan. And so whether those are efficiency projects, new programs and services, policies or guidelines, bringing those forward to fruition, and engaging with people across the campus, trying to find some, the quick win infrastructure projects that we might want to prioritize, and of course continue to build those relationships and those conversations. Although we have a working group that is going to be helping with many of those efforts, it will truly be a campus-wide effort, and we will be reaching out afterwards to follow up with different teams and ensure that everyone understands where we're coming from and where we're going. And I would also invite, after this town hall, all attendees today to complete a brief follow-up survey to understand how confident you feel in this direction and where you'd like to learn more and how we can continue to work together over the coming years. So with that, I think I will turn things back over to Jean, and I believe we will be just about ready to start question and answer.
Thank you, Matt, for your comments and for saying that you're excited. I'm excited too, and it's going to take the whole community to pull this off. So I think that's great. And thanks also for reminding everyone that the full report is available online at uwaterloo.ca/sustainability/shift-neutral. We are now moving into the question and answer period. So on your Microsoft Teams screen, there should be an icon that says Q&A. And you can click on there and begin to type your questions, and they will be assembled here, and we'll move many of them through to me. Of course, we'll try to be efficient and answer all that we can, but if we don't get to your question, we promise that we'll respond to it after the event. And I should say too that many of you, when you registered, also provided us with questions, and we'll be interleaving some of those with the new questions that come in. Before we go to the first question, I just want to say that the people responding to the questions will include, of course, our president and Matt, but also a number of other campus stakeholders and experts. We have Stepanka Elias, who's the Executive Director of Facilities. We have Rob Huntsberger, who's the Director of Design and Construction. We have Chris Ford, who's the Manager of Mechanical Engineering and the Plant Ops. We have Dan Scott, who's the Executive Director of the Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change. And we have Josh Gibbons, who's the practice lead for energy and carbon solutions and a senior associate at Walter Fady, who's been doing the energy audits of our campus buildings. So as we receive questions, I will try to funnel it to the appropriate person or persons, and they'll also, of course, volunteer at times to answer the questions. I'm going to begin, as you begin to type your questions, let me begin with a couple of the questions that came in advance. And I want to start with sort of one that places us in the moment. And of course, that is we are in the middle of a global pandemic. And so one of the questions that came in was how the university's environmental impact and energy consumption changed when we moved online and away from campus relative to what we typically have. And so I'm going to ask Matt and Stepanka if they can maybe make some comments on that.
Yeah, maybe I'll start first with some of the non-energy sources of emissions, because we've actually seen a huge change, particularly on our travel patterns as a university. And so, of course, with fewer people coming to campus, we see a massive drop in the number of commuting emissions that would be a result of students and employees driving or traveling otherwise to the university. And so there's a good news story in part because of that. I think the other piece would be on flights from university business. Similarly, of course, most of that activity has been suspended except for emergency services or emergency travel. And so when you recall in that bar graph or that pie graph earlier, that was a pretty substantial portion of our overall emissions, and certainly not the way that we wanted to actually reduce those emissions by any means. But that's had a tremendous impact on our carbon footprint in those areas. And maybe we'll try pivoting to Stepanka then on the building energy side.
We don't hear you, Stepanka.
There was an audio connection issue there earlier, so I might. Stepanka did send me some notes ahead of time, which I could reiterate really quickly on her behalf if that's okay. And I think we might be surprised to think that, well, there's not a lot of people on campus, and so our energy footprint must have gone down quite a bit. And we might actually be surprised that there isn't, you know, a huge impact on our emissions and on our energy consumption for the university. You know, our goal has always been to support the people that are in the spaces that are here right now. And so, you know, whether it's one person or 100 people in a building, that still requires ventilation and heating and cooling over time. And so there has been maybe not as much, if at all, of a change in the energy consumption of our buildings, despite a huge change in how we use the buildings. That being said, I do want to recognize plant operations did make some changes over the summer, working closely with the safety office and in consultation with the sustainability office to modify some of the scheduling and some of the set points for temperature and stuff across our buildings to try and find efficiencies where we could. And so over the next couple of days, there will actually be a request going out from the safety office to update your plans for campus preference. There will be a section on this for space and infrastructure considerations. So, you know, as you see that go out, please do review carefully and help us to identify opportunities where we can reduce our energy consumption, where it makes sense, while again building that safety and continuing to support the academic work that needs to happen on the campus.
Okay, thank you, Matt. There was a related question that also came in advance, and I'm going to ask Chris if he could respond to this. This actually came from the President's Town Hall that we had not long ago, Ferridan. And so this one is: Waterloo's emissions were 8% higher in 2019 than in 2015. Can you comment on why? We can't hear you, Chris.
Sorry. Right. Generally speaking, the consumption of natural gas follows the weather and the growth of the campus. So as the campus gets larger, we end up using more gas, and as the weather goes up and down, it also tracks that path. So 2018 and 2019 have been substantially warm or colder than the years gone by, about 4%, 5%, depending on the year. And so with that and the growth of campus, it explains our general upward trend and why we have to get a handle on new construction so that it doesn't make the situation worse.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, Ferridan, yes.
Chris, isn't it related to where we buy our electricity, the source of our electricity?
There is a component, not so much where we buy it, but the grid for Ontario has a component of natural gas associated with, or with greenhouse gases associated with it. And as the province reduced their coal-fired plants, our resulting greenhouse gas emissions dropped. And it's basically bottom lined now. And the gradual trend and the forecast for the grid of Ontario is going to be climbing in its greenhouse gas emissions. So that also plays into it as well. You're quite correct.
Thank you for that follow-up question and answer. We just had a question come in that I think this is a good time to ask it, because it gets us to understand a little bit some of the language that's used when we talk about emissions. And so the question is, can someone tell us a bit more about what is meant by scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and where we're at with respect to those? Matt, you're nodding. Does that mean you want to take it? Yep, thank you.
Yeah, I think those are technical terms. They're resulting from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is a standard for organizations and corporations around the world to generally quantify where they are creating emissions. And the principle behind it is to make sure that there's not overlap or duplication in that accounting of where emissions come from. And so they're basically broken where scope 1 emissions are direct emissions that happen on site from any company. So for the University of Waterloo, that would be things like burning natural gas. burning fuel in our fleet vehicles. Those would be our two, biggest sources of Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 are indirect but energy-related emissions. In our case, that's electricity. So the emissions are happening somewhere else. As Chris mentioned, the province is burning natural gas somewhere, or coal in the past, to generate that electricity. But it's us that's purchasing it, and we're largely responsible for generating it. And then Scope 3 is pretty much everything else that's indirectly connected to the university. And so other entities would technically own those emissions. They would be somebody else's Scope 1 emissions. But the activity that we do here on campus influences those emissions being created. So the best examples of that would be the waste that we generate, the flights that we take, the again, commuting to and from the campus. Those would be emissions that are owned by the landfill or by the airline or by us as individuals, but the university's activities are influencing them being created. And so it's a mechanism to understand how emissions are under varying spheres of our influence and where are our opportunities to reduce emissions, either directly or indirectly.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have is coming on the feed, but it's almost identical to a number of other people having asked a very similar question. And so the question, I think, goes to Ferritin and anyone else, but it really relates to our investments. And so the question is phrased like this: is the management of the university endowment and its commitment to responsible investment considered within this shift to neutral plan that we have? And will this shift to neutral impact our investment strategy? So it's the connection between today's focus, which is on this plan, which is a campus plan, and broader issues such as investment. So Ferritin, maybe you could start us off, and then others that have comment could add in.
A very good question. We had a significant, we devoted a lot of time to this question at our last Board of Governors meeting. A large number of our faculty, students, staff, they brought this point up. Right now, our environmental sustainability action plan for the university that Matt is spearheading is not linked to this, but parallel to this. I should also mention that we are going to advance this conversation because investments at the end of the day are under the purview and authority of the Board of Governors, and as such, it gives that responsibility to its Finance and Investment Committee. And there will be a significant conversation about this as to see what is in our ability to really minimize investments by everybody's participation and agreement. But this is a parallel conversation in addition to what this committee is doing. But I expect that it will be accelerating quite rapidly in the next few months.
Okay, thank you. The next question that came in advance expressed concern, and it was concern that Waterloo's 2030 targets aren't aligned with the Paris Agreement. And so the question was, could we explain the gap and how we're going to address it? So I wonder, Dan, whether I could ask you just to say a little bit about the Paris Agreement and your thoughts on this from maybe a broader perspective, and then I could maybe ask Matt to comment a little bit more from the plan's perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Jean. Yeah, just for the benefit of those who aren't familiar with the Paris Climate Agreement, the targets that the international community has set within that to limit climate disruption, or global warming as it's typically measured, is to keep global warming below about 2 degrees or ideally 1.5 degrees versus pre-industrial era. For context, right now we're at about just below +1. The newest climate models we have our current emission trajectories putting us on a path to about +4. And if current Paris pledges by countries are successful, that would hold us to about the low to mid +3 range. So the countries realize they have more to do, and that is an explicit part of the Paris Climate Agreement. They have nationally determined contributions, which are based on countries' differing abilities, and so you will see a range of targets set, and then within countries sectors and organizations like ours set their targets based on circumstances. And I'm sure Matt will relate to that, how that decision was arrived at. But that's also why we have carbon markets, so that we can support the most effective ways to decarbonize our economies as quickly as possible, but with the most efficient economic efficiency as well. And we will have opportunities, check-in stops, as Matt alluded to in his presentation, where just like countries, the potential to ratchet up our targets will be there based on opportunities such as if we get stronger government support on the climate file in our province, there'll probably be new opportunities to do that in the near future.
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, and I think I'll echo that point in terms of one of the pieces that we wanted to really emphasize was the feasibility of actually achieving what we set out. I think if we look at the 2030 targets that we have put in there, especially compared to the trajectory that we are on historically, that's a pretty big shift, and it's a pretty enormous undertaking that's wrapped up and embodied in the targets that we've already set out. So I want to make sure that we're putting forward something that is ambitious but actually achievable. We actually look to there's a modeling tool that's called the Science-Based Target Initiative. It's a tool to help organizations set targets that are aligned with the Paris Agreement targets, essentially. And so we referenced for that 35% by 2030 target is quite closely tied. It's impossible to say that it's precisely tied to that target, but fairly well aligned with that well below 2 degrees scenario. But knowing the amount of additionality that would need to go into the 1.5 degree scenario, we struggled to find really clear pathways on how we would get there without significant disruption to most aspects of the campus. And so I think it's really that balancing of feasibility is what we were aiming for, while still pushing the envelope quite far. And again, as Dan mentioned, I hope that there is an opportunity for that ratcheting up mechanism over time. And if we look at how other campuses are responding, a major tool that many of them are using to get to more immediate interim targets is through carbon offsetting. And so there's a mechanism to do that through the market. And again, we want to prioritize, actual emission reductions wherever possible and energy efficiency wherever possible. So that's some of the decision making that went into that target being what it is.
Okay, thank you. We have more questions coming in, and some of them are connected. So I'm going to take 3 questions that really deal with the broader issues about global challenges like climate change and how we're trying to connect with it from a research, a teaching, and a community outreach point of view. And I think I'll start with teaching, because one of the follow-ups was about that, and one of the questions that we had in advance was also about that. So I'm going to read one of the follow-ups, and it's this, and then we'll sort of try to bundle them together. So one interpretation of this question is that a lot of academic programs don't include teaching about sustainability or climate change, and the question is, are there plans to do that better? And then there's a follow-up that says, and what about capstone projects like in engineering, and who can we connect with? So I'll maybe just, if I may, as moderator, just partially answer the teaching question, and then I'll maybe let Dan, Scott, and others to respond. But I will say just a year or so ago, we passed a new sustainability diploma that's open to the entire campus, and it requires 4 courses, but 3 of the 4 come from lists of courses that students in all of the faculties would often be taking or have as an elective in their normal course of studies. There's only 1 in addition. And the core course will introduce all of the Sustainable Development Goals, including 13, which is climate. But in the list of electives on the science side, both a second-year science course and a second-year geography course deal with climate change specifically, and those courses are open to the entire campus. And so that's a nice starting point. But maybe, Dan, I'll let you add it a bit more about the teaching, and maybe Matt, and then we can think about it more broadly in terms of how the President's Advisory Committee is dealing with the rest. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Gene. Yeah, so just in addition to what Gene said on sustainability broadly, I'd also just point out that we are national leaders on climate change specific education. We have pioneering programs like our Master of Climate Change, which is the only one of its kind in Canada that's now in its 8th or 9th cohort. We have the only online climate risk management diploma in the country. So we've been leading in that space for quite some time, and we're hoping to add some of that to our undergrad programming as well. You see thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of youth marching in the streets with a passion to move climate action, and we don't want to have them wait until a grad degree to come to us. We'd really like to get them in earlier, get them engaged in co-op. We have so many new employers looking to build their climate teams, and we think we're ideally placed. So we're hoping to add there. And we're also moving our education leadership off campus. We have a new, soon to be launched teachers portal with online materials for them. They've struggled with the climate change curriculum before the pandemic. Now with the online learning, it's got those materials. It's got a game that we've developed with the Games Institute, and they'll have online virtual school visits with pro or Olympic athletes to go with it as a nice package to get students involved in. So we're really looking forward to that launch in a couple months. So it'll be ready for the January term for schools. And then to the question about a capstone, that's a great question. We have our Master of Climate Change. We have a projects course that's been open, and we've had a few engineers interested in it. We're looking at if we can, move that across campus so we can build teams from all the different faculties. And we're just looking at how we do that to foster that kind of interdisciplinarity at the grad level.
I could just maybe follow up and saying to the students who wrote that, you could start, I would say, with your undergraduate advisor and then ask them to perhaps connect you upward. Alternatively, you could go right to the sustainability office. Andrea Bale is our engagement coordinator, and she could connect with you too. But Matt, did you want to say a few things?
Yeah, I think, again, the shift neutral piece definitely looks more at the operational emissions, but coming back to the environmental sustainability strategy, there are a lot of conversations happening across campus that, are looking at how to embed sustainability and climate change into curriculum. And so I often have this thought. I mean, there isn't a discipline or a career pathway or an industry that's not going to be touched by climate change in some way, whether it's in adapting to it or mitigating it. And so I would encourage, all departments to be thinking about this as well, in the ways that they can integrate it in whatever way is most meaningful for their discipline. A great example of this, if I might be so bold, I'll pick on the School of Public Health and Health Science. They've been doing some really interesting curriculum evaluation on what is the connection there, and how are those environmental determinants of health connected to things like climate change. So there is a huge amount of curriculum relevance, just given the way that curriculum evolves. I know that's very much led by and championed by the individual departments or faculties, and so I do hope to connect more on that in the future.
Ferdinand, were you nodding because you wanted to say something, or just because you agreed?
I was in big agreement as I was listening to Matt, but I was also reminiscing some of the examples I used to give in my energy and energy conversion systems course. And I will never forget when I had, in my early days in Halifax, I had an apartment, I rented an apartment, and I couldn't control the heat. It was just too hot in the middle of winter, and the superintendent, I said, well, where's the thermostat? He said, it's the window. So it does require a better understanding of what it means to use 1 kilojoule, 1 joule of energy. When you use a piece of paper, how is this paper made? How much energy has gone into it? Lifestyle changes will become so important. So even when we have abundance of energy resources or sources, we should always question, am I wasting this or am I properly utilizing this? I think part of what we are doing on our campus, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, is exactly like this. We're not going to sit in our classrooms with hats and, winter coats, but also, we don't need to be in our t-shirts and sandals in the middle of the winter. Because we can.
Okay, good. I have a couple questions that are, I think, nudging us and pushing us to maybe to go a little further, a little faster, so or a little differently. Let's look at some of those. So one of the questions is this: Western governments and institutions have been paying lip service to environmental matters by nibbling at the margins, taking the tiny steps that look good, but without materially having significant impact on global scale climate. So what are the actual substantial changes that as a campus, University of Waterloo is trying to promote or implement that will lead to material changes, tangible things that we can be proud of? So I'm not sure, Rob, if you want to kick this one off or.
Sure. Thanks, Jean.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I suppose it's worth noting that we, in at the same time as we're developing this master plan to get us to 2050, we have been working actively to deliver better buildings, and buildings really represent upwards of 50% of the carbon footprint globally. And so absolutely buildings have an impact. We've got upwards of 8 million square feet on the campus, and that's that has a substantial footprint. And so if you look back on the more recently procured buildings on campus, we have Environment 3, which was a LEED Platinum building. We've also got the Engineering 7 building, which was essentially shadowing a LEED Silver program. Now, as we really look to amp up our efforts and deliver buildings that are more responsible than building code minimum, we are really actively looking toward other standards that perform much better than LEED. And so LEED, it was a good experiment that we went through on campus. A lot of institutions did the same thing. As we have an opportunity to look back on what that accomplished, we can see sort of some of the shortcomings. It really comes down to the fact that some of the gap was bridged with technology, and that the building enclosure was not made high performance enough. So we're working on the next generation of campus standards that would see higher performing building enclosures, first of all, as a passive approach. So making sure we've got really good air barriers, really good insulation, thermal mass, taking into consideration solar orientation, a number of passive techniques, and then moving toward the more efficient mechanical electrical systems as technology continues to improve. So if we look at our ability to change the next generation of buildings, if, for example, we deliver the next math building or the next engineering building, we're optimistic that we can push the bar much higher.
I was just thinking the next environment building sounds good, just so you know, Rob.
Sure, open up a work request. Love to see it.
I don't very often get to do a plug like that. So, okay, that was fun. Is there anybody else who wanted to Matt, out of it? Thank you.
I can think too. I think a lot of the infrastructure change that will come in this is really critical. And so as we go through some of those technical feasibility studies, there are going to be more tangible projects that come forward as a result of that for funding and for implementation. I think it's also really important to note where there's kind of change levers in some of the systems that we have on campus. And so I mentioned that earlier, things like life cycle costing. And so not making purchasing decisions just on the price of the product or the building that we procure, but the fact that we're owning and operating this infrastructure for the next 50+ years. And so making sure we're counting the energy and the utility costs, the maintenance costs, and everything that goes into the total asset management there. Working through policy to help guide those decisions, I think would be a tremendous change and pivot from that's not just a window dressing action, so to speak, to take that on. And I also think looking at the infrastructure funding that goes into many of this, we will have to identify creative ways of renewing our infrastructure, and when we do that, making sure we're doing it with a sustainability lens in mind.
Okay, thank you. Our next question asks us to reflect on different ways of seeing the challenges and the opportunities. So the question is, how will we integrate Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding into this plan? Of course, we're focused on Indigenous issues related to curriculum and to diversity and inclusion, but we haven't really made explicit in this plan that perspective. I don't know if anyone can provide any insights about how we might do that, Matt?
Yeah, I think they're definitely connected topic matters. there is a certain parallel in many of the issues. I've had a couple of conversations with Jean Becker, not just on climate change, but broadly speaking, how sustainability and Indigenous initiatives can support each other. So that can be something as simple as the way that we manage our landscaping and our grounds, and learning on some of the traditional knowledge that many of our Indigenous communities have for that. Those shouldn't be overlooked. And now that Jean's position is here as of the start of this year, I think we will look to collaborate quite closely on an Indigenous perspective and on an equity perspective more broadly on many of these conversations.
Yeah, that was Jean Becker, the most important Jean, not Jean Andre.
Jean,
yes,
Jean,
of course.
if I may then ask a question to Jean, the Dean Jean. There's another important point that I was hoping that I could have made, but you could do it. We are the Canadian hub for the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So this is very much integrated into also what we do as a sustainable community.
Yes, so I can just say a few things. So 2 years ago, we launched the Canadian chapter of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. We now have 44 university and college members across the country who are coming together to address a number of questions. Some of the early focus was on engagement with community. It was on livable and sustainable cities. And increasingly, we're asking other questions. We've begun to do some work on low carbon. And this is it. This is really exciting because there are 1,300 universities and colleges around the globe that are part of this network, 44 in Canada, but more than 1,000 globally. And so there are all kinds of very, very sophisticated, but also policy relevant modeling teams putting together scenarios for the future in order for us to make informed choices about how we go. And a number of our folks are engaged with it. We've had a host committee that's been managing it primarily within the Faculty of Environment, and the deans just a week or so ago committed to having somebody from each of their faculties engage with us so that we can actually accelerate what this network is doing. So, thank you for that. Okay, the next question here is, we're being asked whether or not what we're doing is sort of synchronous with what other universities are doing, whether we're ahead in some ways. So I wonder if someone could perhaps comment on that. Yeah, Matt's waiting, okay?
Sure, yeah, I think first of all, it's you want to really make sure you're comparing apples to apples, because every university or college around the world has a slightly different circumstance. To the earlier discussion on how are they procuring their electricity, if they're on a very dirty carbon grid, high carbon grid, then they might have very easy opportunities to reduce emissions. So I just want to put that out there, that it's very difficult to compare apples to apples, and you want to be somewhat cautious when you do that, as well as, is it a large institution, a small institution, research intensive, lots of different variables that I would point to. When we look at many of our peers, there is increasingly a strong commitment to action. I would say, looking across, other research intensive universities in Canada, certainly in the US, a strong commitment to be working towards that carbon neutral 2050 seems to be a very common time frame. Some universities are being very ambitious and pushing that up, and they're usually doing that through carbon offsets to make up the difference. But there is definitely a pivot towards ambitious action. In terms of coordination, yes and no. There's lots of networks of action that are forming to kind of, we're all going down this journey together, of course, sharing resources, sharing best practice. A number of them are, the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. They run an annual conference which shares best practices from institutions, largely North America, but increasingly globally as well. We just joined earlier this year the University Global Coalition as well. So there's another emerging network of institutions, in our case, really championed by our president to be a founder of this network, and similar to SDSN, really taking a leadership role as institutions on this and finding ways to mutually support each other. So those are just a couple examples, and I can even say within Ontario, some of the professional networks that, you know, whether it's sustainability professionals, we're connecting quite regularly with our peer institutions. I know on the facilities management side, you know, there's conferences that have touched on moving forward the needle on energy and emissions. So it might actually be an interesting one where on this, you know, everybody needs to get to the same end goal of working towards that carbon neutral, and so there has been a lot of mutual collaboration and cooperation across the industry, which is really great to see.
Okay, great, Rob. Yep.
Yeah, so I guess I want to just launch off of Matt's perspective as well. So I guess specifically on how we compare to other universities, certainly we can look to UBC as a leader nationally. They certainly have a culture that's a little bit more ambitious with respect to sustainability, and they've got the benefit of the climate. So we kind of look to them as kind of a national leader, and then within Ontario, University of Toronto has done some great things. And it's interesting, as we within the Climate and Energy Working Group have been trying to lay the groundwork for the next generation of design standards, we've been moving in a direction, as I mentioned, to sort of follow the passive house methodology to first create high performance building enclosures. But the second strategy embedded in passive house is to limit and set thresholds for energy usage intensity. And it's very difficult. And again, as Matt was mentioning, with our research intensive university, we have a lot of labs, a lot of fume hoods, a lot of equipment that consumes a lot of electricity. And so we're at somewhat of a disadvantage relative to some other universities that are perhaps more arts focused. I mean, it just happens to be the nature of our research intensive university. However, looking at U of T and UBC, they have started to map out some of the targets for energy usage intensity. So we would have kind of a blended standard where for a traditional classroom and sort of office building, we could probably go to something like 50 kilowatt hours per meter squared per annum. But as we approach more energy intensive buildings, that might be closer to the 300 kilowatt hour range. But certainly, in as much as it's difficult to compare, again, because we're not necessarily apples to apples, we see a very strong trend in the methodology, and we share in that philosophy that's seen within UBC and U of T specifically.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say that on the feed, we had a very nice note that thanked all of you for your leadership and on this important issue and for working with the whole community on it. So just want to interject with that nice comment. The next question sort of gets a little bit more technical maybe. So the question is, are there initiatives focused on renewable natural gas that the university could focus on? And could you provide a bit of context and clarify where the majority of our energy is coming from and what we could switch to? And so, we might be able to get Josh in on this, but also Matt. So not sure which one of you wants to start. Josh, okay.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. So right now on campus, there is no renewable natural gas efforts being looked at right now. That being said, there are other organizations that are looking into it, but remember, it's one of a carbon offset strategy. It's one of the, as Matt was saying, it's one of the final tiers that we're investigating. And right now, as part of our kind of program at the university, we've been investigating ways of reducing as basically the first tier of investigation. It's first to reduce energy, reduce carbon offsets, and then finally to look into carbon offset. The other, I think that when I was just looking into it, the City of Toronto has been, they've been investigating a renewable natural gas program with their green waste, and they're using that to offset some of their carbon emissions. So it's certainly something that institutions, municipalities out there are looking into as kind of their last step to get to carbon neutrality.
Okay, thanks. Matt?
Yeah, I think it might be, as Josh mentioned, a part of the solution. I think there's a risk of thinking, well, let's just substitute all the natural gas we use right now with renewable natural gas, and we've solved the problem, so to speak. And so I think it's very much there's still a lot of maturity that's needed in that industry. It's still ramping up. There isn't a lot of capacity in Ontario, and as far as I know, there's some of those pilot projects are really just coming online to ramp that up. So it might be something that has some potential. I will also note there's not controversy per se, but a lot of debate and conversations on the depth of the environmental benefit that comes with that. And there's a lot of accounting practices and other things that go into how the emissions from renewable natural gas are calculated. In theory, there's an offset mechanism that sort of balances itself out. But a lot of times the devil is in the detail for some of those types of projects. And so, again, I don't think it's being excluded. It's certainly not a pillar that we're really leaning on to make a change on as part of what we've envisioned as far as this plan is concerned.
Okay, thank you. There's a question that came in about the vehicles that the university owns and moving those to something that's more environmentally friendly. And I noticed that Stepanka, who's having some audio challenges right now, has in the feed puts a partial response to that. She's talking about looking at the life cycle of the vehicles, looking at the cost and the specific needs with respect to the type of vehicle, and then a comment about charging stations, which are beginning to be installed across campus. So these are the ways that we balance it. But I wonder if anybody else who's on the expert group here wants to comment a little bit more about the vehicle fleet and its evolution. Matt, are you stepping up again?
Yeah, I'll just make a couple high-level points. The charging infrastructure definitely is one piece that we're looking at. I'm hopeful we have a joint application in for funding along with Laurier to expand our charging infrastructure, both for employees and students coming to the campus, but also to help support some of our fleet vehicles as well. And that's been a barrier historically. We actually have been seeing plant operations, central stores renewing some of their more recent vehicles in at least hybrid options or hybrid electric options. So there's definitely a bit of a transition and a shift happening there. And I was actually talking not that long ago with one of our managers in central stores, again, partially because of the circumstances with COVID, but I think they've only had to fill up the one vehicle twice in the entire time they've had it or something to that effect. So, these are starting to be implemented. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and we're certainly seeing other campuses do it. And I would note maybe one other piece too, that there's a lot of things we're going to have to pay attention to in terms of grants and other funding opportunities that can make that transition smoother and easier as well.
Okay, I've got a pair of questions now about buildings, and so I'll maybe mention both of them and then get maybe Josh and Chris to comment. So the one is based on the energy audits that were conducted. Can you tell us a bit about the projects that the university is planning to implement with respect to its infrastructure? That's one that maybe Josh could comment on. And the other one, maybe that's for Chris, says, is it really feasible to move toward a carbon neutrality given the energy intensity of some of the buildings like QNC? So a couple of building questions there. So maybe Josh, you first, if you don't mind.
All right, thank you. Well, I can certainly give recommendations to the university on a variety of projects. I'm sure Chris is going to love to implement them. Obviously, the ones that Chris has been working on that we're looking to highlight is lots of lighting retrofit projects. These have been going on for a long time. Certainly, there's still some work to do in that area. Typically, even moving forward, making sure LED lighting products are used in all new areas. Another example of projects to implement, there's lots of room on the controls front to clean up some legacy controls and make things more energy optimized with the control of the buildings. A lot of these don't necessarily take new capital, but they take time and they take programming to accomplish. And there's certainly lots of opportunity throughout the campus on that. And then the third is just some legacy old lab systems. And I know Chris is already looking into that, planning for that. Some of the old constant volume systems supporting old fume hoods, and they're already in the works to do some replacements of that to variable flow systems, more smart building systems. So, yeah. Anyways, there's the list is long, but I think it's exciting to see that there's still lots of potential to tune the university's buildings.
Thank you. Chris, do you want to add a little?
By all means. So, as far as the feasibility of becoming carbon neutral with our buildings, yes, it is feasible, but it's going to take a lot of effort. It starts off optimizing the way that we use our buildings, particularly ventilation. Since most of our greenhouse gas emissions are from heating, from the burning of natural gas, we have to optimize and do it right, the ventilation for our buildings, particularly challenging during COVID. After we've done that, then we can start aggressively recovering all of the energy available from the buildings as they get ventilated. So in a laboratory building, as an example, they have single pass air. The air comes in, it gets heated up or cooled down as needed, and then it gets exhausted. We need to aggressively pick up all of the energy leaving the building so that it can be refed and reused, so that only the air is the only thing leaving the building, not the energy within the air. And those are projects that are very doable. There are technical methodologies today that are available to us, but it's going to take time, it's going to take effort, and it's going to take funding in order to make the modifications to some of our older buildings, as well as some of our newer buildings. So. Okay,
thank you. This is maybe an appropriate question to ask now, since we've been talking about retrofits and new buildings, but Ferdinand, how are we going to pay for this?
We are paying for things one way or another, Gene. It's a matter of planning properly and making sure that we are aligning our objectives appropriately, and we are allocating proper resources. So it all depends on the planning process. If you put it as one of your initial or boundary conditions of your planning, then it's incorporated automatically. Also, the cost of not doing, I think, will be a lot higher than the actual cost of investing in it. So that is one of my key perspectives, and I think it's a matter of do we have a choice? No, we don't have a choice. So if we are going to have a new building on our campus, it has to be at the highest standard of environmental sustainability, or we're not building it, period.
That's music to my ears. Matt, I think you're getting excited. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add in some of the discussions when we were doing interviews with other campuses as well who are going down this same journey. I think when a lot of them have seen success, they really, we look at climate and energy, but put that in the broader context of what needs to happen in the building. And it's kind of that multi-solving approach in many ways. We've at Waterloo and many of our peer institutions, we've got older buildings that are, in need of, renewal and modernization over time. And so we're spending money every year on utility consumption. And so as you start factoring in all of that, again, there's a pathway with appropriate planning that we can optimize some of those costs. If we actually have to look at renewing a building's envelope anyways, because it's just an old building, how do we add the insulation to that and make it as airtight and efficient as possible? And I think trying to dive into that level of detail in one document is next to impossible, but hopefully we're setting out here some of those directions that as those renewal and life cycle decisions are being made over the coming years, we've got some guidelines and we've got some guidance on how to respond to them. And that's not to say that there isn't a need for more funding. There certainly will be. I'm very hopeful now that some of our government partners will be trying to provide resources. There's certainly been a lot of talk about that, and to a certain degree, I think we will be relying and needing that to materialize for many of the projects, not all of them. So that's another consideration to make as well.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, Jean, you have a living example of this question. That's your building, EV3. When it was being designed, I recall a group led by then Dean saying, yeah, the university wanted it to be at silver. maybe we can, you're willing to go up to gold. We want it to be platinum. It's either going to be platinum or we're not doing it. And those are the kind of important decisions then. So, okay, it's going to be I don't know how many, $1 or $2 or $3 million more, but my gosh, wasn't it the right decision and right investment?
It totally was, and for those who don't know that history, I just got to tell you, there were a lot of champions, people just like you on the call, who just wouldn't take no for an answer, and that's how it managed to happen. That people aligned from all the different levels of the organization to make it happen. One of the questions that came in earlier sort of dealt with the report in a little bit more specific way, and I think those of you who were maybe involved in the writing of it would have an answer. The question was, the report, the plan looks staged, like you have to do certain activities first and then other ones come later. Is it really tied to particular time frames, or is it more fluid than that? I'm not saying it's more fluid than that.
Yeah.
Simple answer.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, what we tried to show there is a bit of a visioning on you don't want to, if you have to provide 100 units of solar power, 100 kilowatts of solar power, and your building, if it's properly optimized, should really only need 50, then don't provide 100 and, fix your building, make it as efficient as you can first, and then provide the renewable or other things to bridge the gap to remove the remaining carbon. So I think that was one of the visions. There is a lot of stuff that can happen in parallel. So it's trying to show that journey and some of that thinking behind it, of that efficiency first kind of mantra, or, waste not before you try to provide a different source of energy. And that's often where a lot of potential cost savings opportunities come in as well. So maybe Josh can speak to that as well, in terms of some of the road mapping that Walter Fady has done in other institutions as well, or other clients as well.
There we go. Yeah, thank you. So it's certainly not a a step 1, step 2, step 3 type approach, but you certainly need to keep them all in perspective. With the main thing is you want to make sure you don't basically pigeonhole yourself throughout the process. So the main thing would be to kind of realize your full vision, where you wanted to go, and provide designs, infrastructure that fit that way. So even within your current designs and projects that are going in right now, you don't want to make sure that 4 or 5 years down the line, when you kind of firm things up, that you just haven't installed infrastructure that's not going to work for the future. So that's why you just have to have a pretty good vision on where you're going to be going, and then to make sure you don't basically pigeonhole yourself, and basically, just because, like Matt was saying, because your buildings are 50 plus years old, or you're planning for them to be around for that long.
Okay, that's actually a useful answer, because some of the questions that were coming in were also about when you do a tear down, when you do renovations and so forth. And I think what you're saying is you have to assess each building in terms of its where it's at and its potential to sort of be improved. Is that do you want to comment any further? Or I've got nods from
yeah, sure. Yeah, I can sure comment. So it's certainly good to take stock of the buildings that you have. There's certainly good to do retrofits when it makes sense. At some point, there's a lot of the systems are connected. So lab ones as an example, when you have a widespread constant volume HVAC system, it's not always easy to just retrofit. You can't piecemeal retrofit that thing. It's a holistic system, and it all works together. And at some point, when you want to make the step, you have to almost go back to the bones and rebuild it up as a variable flow system. That would be the lowest energy point. At least from a mechanical perspective, that's kind of a good example.
Okay, Thank you. We just have time for a few more. I'm just going to mention, but maybe not ask you to respond, but there's more feed in on the buildings, and in particular on, I think, urging us to think about net zero buildings, not just energy efficient buildings as we move forward. So I just wanted to make sure we flagged that. So the second last question I'll ask is, are we looking at non-energy aspects as we think about this shift neutral, for example, things related to single-use plastics or waste? Are there other pieces that are feeding in that maybe we should just highlight briefly? Matt, is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I can jump in, and there is a section in there, and that's that kind of indirect sources of emissions that I mentioned earlier, waste being certainly a part of that. And so there is a lot of effort around minimizing single-use items more broadly, including plastic, but waste minimization overall. I actually saw yesterday, it looks like Food Services is reintroducing the eco-container program in the one of the residence buildings. And so there's a reusable takeout program that, there's a deposit structure that students can use to access that. And, a really fantastic example of some of those strategies that can be put in place to minimize any type of single-use item. And so that will be part of that. Again, it's actually connected to the sort of shift zero on the zero waste mentality to be integrating across the campus. One other point that I'll add, I talked a little bit already about commuting and business travel that is increasingly being looked at is the carbon footprint of our infrastructure in and of itself, not just the energy that's used, but also the energy and the emissions that go into building a new building. So that's things like steel and concrete, very energy intensive, very emissions intensive pieces of our, in fact, if we look at the global level, a huge chunk of our global emissions actually come from those two industries alone. And so how do we not just look at the energy efficiency from a carbon perspective of our buildings, but also even the design and the materials that we use. So that's something that's flagged in the climate action plan, getting better understanding of what that looks like and some strategies to look at that. We've got new generations of wood buildings coming online and lots of cool different ways of playing with different building materials. Maybe Rob can even speak to that a little bit, but those are just two examples, I think, of some indirect sources of emissions that are certainly highlighted in the plan.
Rob, do you want to just quickly add a comment? We're almost out of time.
I can add a couple of thoughts. I mean, certainly we're looking at all from all perspectives, and there's embodied energy. There's also the decisions as far as what kind of refrigerants that are used in our cooling systems. I mean, some have higher greenhouse gas potential than others. I mean, there's a whole range of things, and we're really leaving no stone unturned. To follow Matt's point about mass timber buildings, that is something that certainly within Canada we have the local resources to do. There's a lot of modernization happening within building codes. Again, looking at our friends on the West Coast, they've been leaders with sort of very strong advocacy from the forestry industry, and they are realizing mass timber buildings. We've got a couple shaping up within southwestern Ontario, and so and the advantage that University of Waterloo has, probably greater than most of our peers, perhaps not Laurentian, but certainly our peers in southwestern Ontario, we have land. I've always been sort of dreaming that if we could sort of carve off a piece of land on the North Campus and basically create a tree farm where in 20 years we could build Engineering 12 out of mass timber that's harvested right on site. So I mean, with the benefit of land, we've got the room to kind of spread out, plant renewable resources, take a look at solar as was done already on the North Campus Tech Park with the Evolve One sort of business park building. But certainly there are, if we dream, there's opportunities to sort of dream big.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And I'll just notice that Stepanka also wrote in that university is looking at environmentally friendly disposal of masks and PPE, which I think is fantastic to hear. Okay, very last question, and you have to be very quick. I'm going to ask each person to just use 4 or 5 words. The question that has come in is, how can the average staff, student, or faculty member do something to help us achieve the plan? So as many as want, but only 3 or 4 or 5 words, not a full idea development. So who would like to say something? Okay, Rob. and then
I'll
Chris.
just go first, just because I think I'm probably still the last, I'm still alive. But I would say go to projectneutral.org. You can input your own lifestyle, how much you drive, sort of map out your own carbon footprint. And as Faradin mentioned, there's a whole host of lifestyle changes that we need to think about, and I think that's a good starting point to even measure our own personal footprint as part of our individual contribution to the whole.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Dress for the weather. Turn off your lights, close your fume hoods, please and thanks.
Okay, any other inspiring moments? Matt?
I'll just say connect with the Sustainability Office. We do have programs that we run for students, staff, or faculty on engaging you on campus. So a lot of these things seem to be very high level, but there are a lot of tangible initiatives that are happening to engage individual users or teams across the campus.
Okay, anybody else? Dan?
Just the pandemic has thrust technologies like this upon us. Use this as an opportunity to look forward when you plan your travel, when we get back to business as new normal. Use what you've learned this through PhD defenses, communications like this. Let's make use of this technology that we've learned to use over the last couple months.
Okay, all right, with that then I'm going to bring to a close, and I want to thank the president and also Matt and all of the panelists here who've been answering our questions. I want to thank you all for participating. Thank you so much, of course, to the attendees. You're what makes the town hall work, and we'll follow up with any questions that we weren't able to address here. And with that, I'm just going to leave it to our president to take the last 2 minutes to make a closing comment.
Thank you, Jean. Let me first start by thanking you for being a fantastic moderator, but also for your great leadership in getting many things moving forward and still continuing to do so. As an institution, we remain committed to sustainability. There is no other option. Not that because we don't have another option. This is our responsibility as an education and research institution. We must do everything we could in our ability, make sure that we have a much better understanding, deeper understanding of what lies ahead, what has happened, and also what needs to be done. And as an institution, we also need to practice what we preach. And this is what it's all about, how we are incorporating our teaching and research into what we do and how we do things on our campus. It has taken us a long time since the Industrial Revolution to cause the kind of damage that we're talking about to our air, to our land, to our oceans. And it's going to take all of us to make sure that we are moving towards a better environmental future. Otherwise, we could see, what lies ahead. Our commitment is clear. There is a lot more work to be done, but I don't feel not any time at all that this is unsurmountable. This is something that I feel alone. As Matt mentioned, we are working with a lot of organizations around the world, but the ones that I'm really counting on is our community, is our people, students, staff, faculty here that are as committed as we are. And I'm really grateful for your participation today. It was a great session. We heard from all of you, and this is a conversation that we will continue, and we will report every time we make better progress, and it is our commitment to make better progress. With that, thank you so much. We'll see you next time.